Yeah, and it's also yeah, it's like who are the tampons hurting? Like I feel like your reaction was totally normal to be like, "Huh, that's interesting." And then like to realize what it was about and then like I think it's strange for anyone to have like a fixation on it as if it's
Yeah.
impacting their workday. You know, it's like what's the
Yeah.
tampon doing to you?
Yeah, and I know like there'd be a contingency of people that'd be like, well, tampon shouldn't be in a men's bathroom, but it's like, does it bother you that much? Like I did again, like I never even thought about it from that day forward, you know? Like I was more focused on the fact that they had like disposable toothbrushes, which I loved in the bathrooms, and like floss and all these things. They had accommodations like
Yeah.
that for everybody, and I just thought that was great, you know, that they thought of everybody. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, like, because it sounds like the people who worked at Meta, and I've heard this too from people who have reached out, and people were there for a long time. Like, how many years were you there for?
5 years. I was there
5 years.
five
So,
years.
like, people probably still there expect a certain type of environment. That's not, I imagine it's not easy, but it's also not like, the Coliseum where people are battling it out. So, like, it'll be interesting to see that shift and whether they bring in people who fit this new, like, macho masculine molds, men and women,
Yeah.
or if people have to almost like adapt their personalities. And I saw this like 10 plus years ago when I worked at Uber. Like, I saw people change. I swear they like changed their brains or their personalities in some way to compartmentalize. Like they used to be a person that was like not as highly political or cutthroat, and then they saw what they needed to do to stay on and retain their stock options,
Yeah.
and they wanted, like you're saying, this generational wealth, this like life-changing amount of money. And people do change like when they think that that's on the table, and some people it's more nuanced than that too. I think like people, it's not like people go from like Jekyll to Hyde or Hyde to Jekyll. Like it's, I think there are shades of it. Um, but I wonder, like, if you think that the culture as a whole will just change, if they'll replace people with other more cutthroat people, or if people will have to almost change the way they go about doing things in order to fit this new mold. Or maybe, like, this is just an initial thing that Zuckerberg is doing to pander to Trump and his people.
Yeah.
Who knows? But I'm just, yeah, I wonder what that, because it sounds like it's such a good, it had been a good workplace for a lot of people, and now
Hmm.
it's, if it is changing, I wonder what that will do to, the existing people or new people coming in.
Yeah, I would wager because I've seen it firsthand as well too. Again, my time after Meta, I was at a company that, again, as a reference, was very toxic, and I saw people very, like to your point, very slowly like dismiss their moral fiber because they were afraid of like losing their job, things that I would talk to somebody when I first started and like somebody else was new at this company that they would be very strongly opinion on certain things that we were doing that were unethical. 6 months later, they're like totally like fine with doing stuff that 6 months ago they were not okay with doing. So I could see a slope like that. I certainly hope it doesn't, but because I do like, again, the company is not without its problems, but I do think that the Facebook platform, the Instagram platform, WhatsApp, there is a lot more good than bad. You could have a very different opinion, Ariel. That's totally fine. But like I know, for example, like I don't live close to my family. Like I'm in the middle of the country. My family's all East Coast, and a great way to keep in touch has always been Facebook. I mean, it's just like so
Yeah.
like things like that for that reason. And I know people around the world have very similar stories. So again, I just am really sad to see like some of these like things that made it such a truly special place to work are just being tossed aside because it does feel a little bit like pandering. And I hate to say that. It just feels that way.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Do
some would
you think
argue maybe he's
there,
being good. some would argue maybe he's being a good CEO and doing what's best for the company. Like you've got to like take your political stance, and you know maybe that's the case, or maybe he's doing what's best. His job is to keep the shareholders in mind, right? And
Right.
maybe that's the best thing that he's doing right now. But at the same time, it's like two things can be true. Like maybe he's doing the best thing for the company, but it also can be sucky at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Do you think there will be a rise in discrimination lawsuits and other types of actions, not just at Meta, but like across the board with all of these programs being like all of these companies are saying like, "Oh, we're not going to waste our time on this anymore." Like what do you think what do you think the effects of that will be?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, to your point, not just at Meta, I do think that it's hard to say because again, I'm going back to my experience at Meta, like how things that were like handled really, really well. Like anytime there was like an employee complaint or kerfuffle, if there was a disagreement or like an HR type of investigation, I always felt it was handled extremely, extremely well and professional, and the right things were typically done from what I saw. But I do think that yeah, I do think there's going to be a spike in corporate America. Now, does that mean these lawsuits will be successful? That's another topic because, as we know, the courts are swinging on a pendulum as well too. When you look at the Supreme Court,
Right.
and that could have downstream impact as well too. I really hope companies understand that discrimination is still against the law. Just because like you're getting away with, you're moving away from your DEI initiatives, that doesn't mean you can like now like, hey, we can discriminate now. That's awesome. Um, but the reality is that even with DEI programs, companies still discriminated. They just got very good at like
Yeah,
fighting
that's a good
that,
point.
you know? You know?
Right, right. Back to the masculinity thing for a second. How do you like as a man, how do you define masculinity? Like when you saw him talk about that, was it like because I feel like it's a complicated question, but I'm just
Mm.
curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that is a good question because I don't love the concept of it. You know what I mean? It's just something
Yeah.
that, like, I mean, I know what like I've been taught, and I know what books say about like masculinity is. To me, how I would define it for myself is, providing for my family and teaching my kids the ropes and about how to live a good life. Like to me, that's masculine. Like taking care and providing shelter, comfort, resources for my
Yeah.
family. Um, but others define because it is a type of word that can have a different definition depending on who is speaking to it. What is it? I don't even know. I've never looked it up in the dictionary. Like, what is masculinity? How is it even defined?
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, there's so much conversation about like masculinity and femininity and like how
Yeah,
they exist within those poles, and I think it's all the more interesting to talk about it in a work context too, because it like what he's saying almost implies that you have if you like exhibit any like feminine traits, man or woman, like you should not be in a corporate environment or in a workplace that's like meta, which is wild to me because I feel like it just is going to get so nasty if there isn't a same thing. I think if there's too much like I do think if there's too much like I don't know. If there isn't an energy or like a pulse to a thing, then it dies. But like, you don't need to be punching people in the face to prove that you have like a pulse as a company. And it just feels like what you were saying earlier that it's these two extremes, and like I can't help but like bring in the tampon thing too. That it felt like some people were like, "That's an assault on my masculinity to see tampons," but it's like Does it really make you feel like less of a man to see a tampon? Like then you should really have a like a moment with yourself about your masculinity. If like the sight of a like packaged good next to all the other things that you mentioned in the bathroom sends you spiraling into thinking that someone's calling you a woman.
Yeah.
To me, that just shows a lot of insecurity about masculinity. But I think
Yeah,
it's
I mean, I was gonna say too, is like I define masculinity as just being comfortable in your own skin, you know what I mean? And like
yeah,
having the courage to be comfortable and not get upset over things that like have like no impact on you. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Um,
When you were
but
recruiting people, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, but femininity, masculinity, stereotypically, people would say uh, femininity means like being more feel like having more feelings, being a little bit more emotional, right? If you will. That's the
Yeah,
stereotype behind it. And again, like Meta was really good about providing mental health resources. You know what I mean? Like we had so many like free therapy sessions per year. Like our benefits were wonderful. Does masculinity mean not being in touch with your feelings anymore? That's what I think a lot of people would take that as, like, do you know how many times, like, yeah, I'd be on
that
a
to me,
call. Yeah, yeah.
no, I was just gonna say that to me just doesn't even seem like business sense. Because if you have no emotional intelligence, we're
Mm,
all people interacting, right? Then like you can't function, right? If you're just
mm.
like we're all totally rational, we have no feelings, we're just these animals basically feeling testosterone and acting in survival mode. Like I feel like we're more evolved than that, and it doesn't make business sense to like ignore that emotions are a part of like any sort of business dealing, or especially obviously in your line of work.
It just shows a lot of binary thinking too, right? Like, why does it have to be one thing or the other? Like it just, again, it just goes. I'm a big Star Wars fan. It's like only Sith Lords. I don't know if you understand this reference. I'm a
Yeah.
big nerd. Like only Sith Lords believe in absolutes. Like I feel like a lot of narcissistic people. I'm not calling Zuck that, but you
Yeah.
know, um, have an inability to see gray. It's everything has to be in a perfect, neat box, and if there's any blurred lines, that's really uncomfortable for some people for some reason, and um, it's never been that way for me. Like I understand that multiple things can be true at the same time. Um, so sorry, were you gonna ask something else though? I think.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna ask if you ever like as a recruiter, if you ever scanned for like were like the masculine feminine polls ever things that you looked at when you were interviewing people and getting a sense for who they were and would they be a culture fit and would they be a fit for a team,
Mm.
and like if someone ever came across as like overly masculine in the sense that Zuck is talking about. Like what was that like a red flag for you? Did you place them in teams sometimes because they like would have been a fit because they just fit into that style? Or like how did you handle that? Just different
Um,
personalities because I'm sure you've seen so many different personalities.
I have, and I've seen at a companies that like over-index on personality assessments, and they're like looking for like high drive and high dominance. You know what I mean? Like, and I think most people would associate masculinity with dominance. And so I wasn't a recruiter in that scenario. I was a recruiting manager, and seeing my team struggle with like. I talked to this guy who was a real asshole over the phone, but his personality assessment is exactly like what we're looking for, and I'm going to move them forward. And I've definitely talked to people as a recruiter that were overtly confident or cocky, and I think I try not to make sweeping generalizations or decisions. I'll take every situation as is. If they were competent and were able and they met the qualifications and were able to answer my questions, I would probably move them on. But I might flag that to a hiring manager of like, hey, good conversation. This person checks all the boxes. Just so you know, came across as very overly confident in my interview, something that you might want to, be on the lookout for if that's something that may not sync with your team.